Thanks everyone who's here in person, and thanks to those of you, I think I overheard 31 or something like that online. It's a little weird to have that many more people watching than in person, but still good. So what I wanted to talk about today is some work looking at ethical issues around deepfakes. So as Kathleen said, I'm head of the Department of Philosophy. My original training is in philosophy, although I've done a lot of things in machine learning and psychology and policy as well. And so really trying to take a look today at the ethical issues that surround deepfakes and other kinds of synthetic media. And I'm going to use certain kinds of terms like synthetic or highly manipulated media kind of interchangeably for today. If you want to dive into the weeds of where it makes a difference, exactly which one we're talking about, then we can do that in the Q&A. I want to make sure to acknowledge from the start, all of this work is fully collaborative and joint with Jack Parker, sitting in the back there in the red and black. So, but I'm the one who you have to listen to for the next period of time. You know, this crowd, I hope it isn't something that requires very much explanation, that synthetic media, deep fakes, highly manipulated media, misinformation, disinformation, these are all problematic in one way or another. I take it that that is a presupposition that we all have when we walk into this room, given the interest that we all have. Now, I'm primarily today going to focus on this idea of synthetic media, which is to say media that is largely, if not entirely, generated via relatively more advanced computational technologies, and that presents things that didn't happen in an important way, or presents things that, let me say this differently, things that purport to be media, video, images, and so forth, from purported events, but are not actually directly of those events or non-events, right? So synthetic media can be entirely fake in the sense that it can be a deep fake of something that never occurred. It can be a deep fake of something that truly did occur, but we don't happen to have video of it, for example. So we're already starting to see this with political campaigns generating synthetic video of, for example, you know, the candidates' actions in a wartime setting where there may not be contemporaneous video, and yet they want to have the power of video to show the heroism of the candidate, for example. Now, there's not going to be a bright line here, right? It isn't as though it's a synthetic media if it's 100% artificial, but you know, if you include an actual picture of a foot somewhere, suddenly, oh, now it's not a deep fake, now it's not synthetic media. It is a continuum, and the continuum is going to include things like what people are, I think, amusingly referring to as cheap fakes. So things like the slowing down and manipulation of the Nancy Pelosi video, where it was slowed down to give the clear impression that she was drunk or otherwise intoxicated. And you know, there's nothing in some sense fake about it in terms of it was the actual video footage. It was just massively slowed down in deceptive ways. So I don't want to try and draw, and I don't want to get into, this will sound very strange coming from a philosopher, but I don't want to get into semantic distinctions. I know that's what we're all notorious for wanting to do. I actually don't want to do that. What I want to focus on are this general class of phenomena where people are producing images and media that clearly are not of the original event, but purport to be, and looking at the ethical issues that surround that. Now, when I use the word ethics in a lot of communities, people get really, really nervous and scared. My experience is that typically is because they think of ethics under one of two models. So one model that a lot of people have is that ethics is all about rules and regulations and law. Okay? But sort of philosophy 101, what is legal is not always ethical, what is ethical is not always legal. These are two different normative systems that we put up to prescribe and constrain behavior. Okay? But what we mean by ethical principles, guidelines, and maxims is not simply sort of how it gets codified in the law. And that's going to be particularly important when we talk about some of the ethical issues around responses to things like deepfakes, is that it isn't just a matter of what the law requires or forbids. The other way that I think people think about it is they think about ethics as the cops. That ethicists are those people that you've built this really amazing technology, and right at the end they come in and go, no, I'm sorry, that would be unethical, you can't use that. That's not the right way to think about ethics either. It's not a plug-in module that you add to some technology right at the very end. It's not a piece that just shows up at the end of the development or at the end of the policy process, but rather needs to be something that is there from the beginning. I think instead we should think about ethics as asking and attempting to answer this fundamental question. Given what we value, it's really two questions, but the first question here is, and the one I'm going to focus on today is, given our values and interests, what is it that we ought to do? Now, when you put it that way, it's pretty easy to see that we are all ethicists all the time. Given what you valued as of 30 minutes ago, ought you come to this talk? That's an ethical decision, because it's asking you to decide how your values and interests are going to manifest in behavior. Now, it hopefully wasn't an ethical dilemma where your values are pulling you in opposite directions. Maybe it was. Maybe you thought, wow, I'd much rather sit in my beanbag chair and take a nap, right? So it may well have pulled you in different directions. That's what we mean when we talk about an ethical dilemma. But it's fundamentally not about the question of sort of deep ethical principles most of the time. Right? Now, there is this additional piece, which is the other core question that ethics asks, which is, what values ought we have? Okay, and I'm not really going to talk very much about that today, because I think when we think about things like deep fakes and synthetic media, by and large, we don't need to get down to the level of resolving very local disputes about which values we ought to have. There are disputes about how to weight different values and interests. Those absolutely arise, but I think that the moral values and interests are usually fairly straightforward in these debates. And so the focus, I think, really needs to be on this question of, given those values and interests, what should we do? Now, if you've heard about terminology, if you've heard terms like consequentialism, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, Aristotelian approaches, all of these kinds of things, Thomistic ethics, what these really are is they're just frameworks for answering this question. Okay, so somebody says to you, are you a consequentialist? All they're asking is, do you use a particular framework in an effort to answer this question? Okay, it's not about what question to ask. Everybody agrees about what question to ask. They disagree about the best ways to answer it. Now, the good news for the reality of what most of us do in most of our lives is that all of these frameworks agree on 99+% of the cases. Right? They all agree that you ought not punch somebody in the street and take their wallet. And not just because it's illegal, but because it would be unethical. All of them agree that you ought to care for your children and try to ensure that it is important to work to ensure their safety and well-being. Right? Doesn't matter if you're a consequentialist or a deontological approach or virtue, it doesn't matter, they all agree. Right? So for most things, we don't actually have to decide between these frameworks. There are edge cases, but as I'm going to talk about in a second, I think that those edge cases are also exactly the ones that we should probably have a certain amount of epistemic humility about our own ability to know what the right thing is to do when we're dealing with these kinds of technologies. Okay, so given that, you might already be saying, well, wait a second, maybe you think either synthetic media is never ethical, right? It's always deceptive and horrible and bad and we shouldn't ever have it. You might also think, well, it's always ethical because, say free expression or whatever your particular preferences are. The first thing to recognize, I think, is that that's really actually the wrong way to think about it. You shouldn't think about the media in and of itself when we think about its ethical status. Whether it is ethical or unethical. It is not ethical or unethical on its own. That's just the wrong scope at which to think about the media. For those who don't know, most of the technology underlying deep fakes and other synthetic media comes out of the movie industry. I mean, that's sort of is where you see the origin of pretty much all of these technologies is in the movie industry. And there it might be completely ethical to portray an individual who has died saying words that they never said. See the latest Star Wars movies, where this is done repeatedly. It might be completely ethical in a movie context to take somebody like Robert De Niro, who's 70-something years old, and make him look like he's 35, or whatever they do in this new movie that's coming out recently on Netflix. Those are entirely ethical, and yet the very same thing, trying to take a political candidate and making him or her look 20 years younger in a political ad to inspire a reaction that this is somebody who's vital and vibrant, might be really problematic. Having a video, synthesized video of Ronald Reagan saying Donald Trump is the best president we've ever had might be unethical in a way that in a movie context it would be perfectly acceptable. So context matters. Intent matters. What are you trying to do by creating and putting out the media? And the outcomes matter. Whether they, in this particular context, that media results in harms or benefits that are unwarranted or inappropriate. And so how do we answer these kinds of questions? Well, in order to really think about the ethical status, since we can't just look at the ones and zeros, can't just look at the pixel level data, what we need to do is we need to think about the relevant moral interests and moral values that are impacted by it. Okay? And so there's a lot of them. Now, in the worst case, thinking about these values can lead to analyses that take 6 months to figure out whether this particular piece of synthetic media is ethical or not. And so, of course, 6 months later, if you're worried about the ways in which these synthetic media are impacting democracy, for example, waiting 6 months to decide whether it's ethical or not is not a very useful strategy. It leads to a lot of argument and contention. But in fact, in the typical case, I think we can come up with, and this is sort of the kind of argument that I'm going to be making over the course of the next half hour, is that for this and in other cases, we can come up with useful but defeasible heuristics or rules of thumb. Defeasible here in the sense of it is defeatable. Something is defeasible if it's a good, it's a reasonable thing to think. It's not just sort of a we picked it out of thin air default, but yet it can be defeated given certain kinds of other evidence. So some of what I'm going to talk about is going to involve rules of thumb. And you may be sitting there and think, well, but what about edge case XYZ? You can always think about edge case XYZ. That doesn't mean that we can't make generalizations about typical or defeasibly expected case. Now, how that translates into policy will be the second part of this. How do you do things differently if you are Twitter, Facebook, and so on? All right, so what are these relevant stakeholder interests, the moral interests and values that might be relevant when we're trying to evaluate the ethical status of some particular piece of synthetic media? Well, one of the obvious stakeholders are the people who produce it. And they have legitimate moral rights and interests to free expression, to the through political participation, if we think about this in an election context, to the ability to put their voice out into the woods, out into the world. These are not, I want to make sure to note right off the bat, these are not universal, exceptionless rights and interests. We recognize all the time that people's interests in artistic expression can be overruled by, say, whether it's something as extreme, something like hate speech laws, but even just something as banal as copyright law. Even certain kinds of, there are exceptions to copyright law for things like satire, but even there are limits to what is permitted. Okay, so we recognize this legally, we recognize it morally. Another important group of stakeholders when we're dealing with synthetic media are the content platforms, because they are, by and large, in this day and age, at least right now, the dominant vehicle by which the synthetic media are disseminated into the world. There is some that occurs via things like email or other kinds of things that are not social media and other content platforms. By and large, the transmission mechanism is via content platforms. And they, of course, have their own sets of legitimate interests. They want to have people recognize them as being objective. Both morally, they have an interest in this because it is part of a core value of their company. Of course, they also have the legal interest in having that appearance because they want to maintain their platform immunity, as it is sometimes referred to. Of course, perhaps the group that leaps to mind most directly in most cases of deepfakes are the individuals who are directly impacted by it. So especially if we think about things like revenge porn and other uses of the technology to produce content that is clearly intended to harm the reputation or interests of another person, whether it be a political candidate, a former romantic partner, or just somebody you don't like. And those individuals have very real interests that are frequently the deliberate target of the synthetic media. It is being created in part to harm those individuals' interests. Okay? Now, doing things to harm other people's interests does not automatically make something unethical. Any sort of competition that might occur will typically have the side effect or an effect of harming someone else's interests. If Kathleen and I both want this last bottle of water and I go and grab it before she does, I have harmed a legitimate interest that she had in not going thirsty. Okay? It doesn't mean that I did something morally wrong. If we each had equal claim to it, then it may be that it was perfectly legitimate and ethical for me to do it. Okay? So I want to make sure to point out these are the kinds of complexities that can lead to a 6-month effort to figure out whether something was unethical or not. Is because we have to think about what are the legitimate, for example, interests in reputational integrity that a political candidate has versus the right to political participation of somebody who wants to emphasize that this political candidate is a horrible person. So they produce a deep fake of the person harming puppies. Right? And all of a sudden people are horrified by this. Right? Well, they were merely showing what an awful person the political candidate is through the generation of the content. But of course, there's a direct threat to the reputational integrity of the candidate because it's showing them doing something that they never did. Right? Of course, the people who consume the content are not simply those who are directly impacted. We also have to think about the platform users, those who consume content, those who have an interest in having accurate information for their own decision making and so forth. And a fifth group, which seemingly either is the only one people talk about or is never the one that people talk about depending on the context, is the broader political community and the broader social community. And this is when people talk about things like deep fakes as a threat to our very sort of understanding of truth in the world. That if deepfakes proliferate, then we can never know that anything is true. Or it undermines all political discourse because now a political candidate can simply say deepfake to get as a get out of jail free card for anything that they might do and be caught on video doing or for which there might be an image. And so that is itself a set of relevant, important, ethical, and moral interests for that community. We do have an interest in the political community in having some norms of truthiness, even if not quite truthfulness, to steal Stephen Colbert's coinage. But we also have interest in legitimate political debate, where there are certain agreed upon claims or facts to which all members of the debate agree. If there really is nothing on which two people can agree, there's no possibility of political debate and discourse. And so if we hold out the value of legitimate political debate, then we need to have the ability to have these shared touch points. Okay? All right, so all of these different interests, I put them up not because I expect you to necessarily agree with all of them. Each one of them, you notice there's the ... at the bottom because we could give further interests, morally legitimate interests and values of that stakeholder group. Ultimately, in theory, the thing you would do if I produce a deep fake is to judge whether it is ethical. You would need to, again, adopt one of those meta-ethical frameworks, consequentialism, utilitarianism, deontological approaches, whatever it may be, and then actually do all of the work of taking all of the interests, determining their relative moral weights, figuring out how to balance them, exploring whether the net according to that framework was positive or negative, and so forth. That is never going to work. It's not a practical strategy, and in fact, it's not a necessary strategy. So what I want to do here now is try to give you, I think it's 4 defeasible heuristics to guide these things. Because there are certain moral interests that we think are more important than others. It is widely recognized that my moral interest in maintaining my physical safety outweighs your moral interest in free expression. That's why, for example, direct incitement to do harm to me is criminalized. Again, we don't want to blur, we don't want to conflate legality and ethicality, but it is at least indicative that that is an important consideration. Is that generally we think, yeah, you're allowed to say what you have a right to free expression, but not if it leads to somebody being physically injured, all else being equal. Right? So there are these sort of trade-offs that we are already used to making and that we can use to get at some defeasible heuristics. So here's a fairly straightforward one. If I produce a piece of synthetic media with the intent to harm, and perhaps even do significant harm, then the default should be that this is unethical. Right? Just as by default, me uttering things that cause people to want to do harm and perhaps lead to harm to another person, by default, that is not something that is an ethical action. It doesn't mean that it is never permissible. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to say things that cause harm to people. But at least as a first pass default, unless you have additional information about the context and the mitigating factors, it is a heuristic starting point. Okay? As a different heuristic, synthetic media that truthfully presents, remember I gave the example of cases where you recreate things for which we do not have contemporaneous video using synthetic media, that by default those are going to be ethical in nature. Because when you are presenting truthfully information about what actually occurred in the world, it is, yes, there are edge cases where this would not be an ethical thing to do, but by and large, people's interest in knowing facts about, relevant facts about other individuals is going to be outweighing people's desire to keep certain things private, for example. Okay? Now, this is, of course, again, clear edge cases where we would not want to endorse this. If I produce synthetic media that truthfully presents something that you had every reasonable expectation and right to keep private, then I've arguably done something ethically problematic. Okay? But as a first pass default, we can start arguably with something like this as an initial starting point. Okay? We can interestingly distinguish between falsely harming somebody I have falsely promoted and falsely harming. What I mean by that is doing things, presenting content that is false, but acts to promote versus acts to harm, right? So the first one is focused on false information that acts to harm. And the third one is about false information that acts to promote. Okay? Now you notice that there's an asymmetry between the first and third. And that's deliberate because actions that lead me to arguably gain a benefit to which I am not justly entitled is most of the time, ceteris paribus, going to be not as bad as doing something that actively harms another person. Now, of course, by gaining access to a benefit to which I was not entitled, I am going to probably end up harming somebody by virtue of scarcity of resources. But it is not thereby directly harming. And so we draw a distinction between these. And so while it's probably unethical, it may not rise to the level where we would want to say a default. Or it may be that only in certain contexts that we would want to think about this as a default. I'll throw out a fourth one, which is very complicated there, but actually is a very simple idea. And that simple idea is that as deepfakes, as synthetic media are more and more prevalent in an environment and in a context, then we should hold them to higher and higher standards because the sheer numbers are having a negative impact on the morally legitimate interest of having truthful discourse and shared understandings of facts. Okay, so the positively correlated. As you increase the occurrence of synthetic media, you increase what you need to show and prove for something to be considered ethical. Okay, that's the idea. Which is to say, alternately, as you increase, more and more things are going to be judged as unethical because they will fail to meet the standards that we have in mind. Because as more and more things, as the background involves more and more deepfakes and synthetic media, there's a sort of persistent, constant threat and harm to a morally legitimate interests, namely those of the political community to have truthful, shared, productive discourse and epistemic agreement and these kinds of things, right? So because of other people's actions, your synthetic media can be subjected to a higher degree of scrutiny on ethical grounds. Okay? So there's all of these different, there's these, we could come up with more, right? But the point here is to help you give you a flavor of the ways in which you can start to use this as a sort of guide to thinking about what it would be ethical to do or not. And that is to recognize the complexity and the sheer number of morally relevant values and interests, but then to understand that there are sort of patterns that emerge, and it takes work and effort to generate these. I mean, I didn't pull these out of nowhere. These are the product of a lot of conversation and work. But there are patterns that emerge that we can use to have defeasible heuristics. But of course, what we really care about is or I shouldn't say what we really care about. What I'm particularly concerned about is not simply, is this thing ethical or not, but what, if anything, should we ethically do about it? Right? Because I could produce something that's a horribly unethical deepfake, but if it sits on my computer and nobody else ever sees it, it's not done any harm to anybody. And so while it might be sort of deplorable that I did that, as a policy matter, as an attempt to intervene and help, do my little part to protect democracy, there's nothing to be done, necessarily. Okay? More generally, the mere fact that something is unethical does not automatically imply that any particular person has an obligation to do anything about it. Okay? There can be unethical acts that occur in this world where no one individual, we might have a collective obligation to do something, but no one individual has an obligation necessarily to sort of fix it. Now, as a result, what we have to do is think about these many more complicated things. So it may be that Ryan does something unethical, and you might think that I should be the one to do something about it. Sorry, Ryan. You show up late, this is what happens, right? But it might be that I simply lack the causal power to do anything about it. Right? He's not my student, so I can't do anything, or whatever the case may be. I don't have the ability to mitigate or remedy the harms that he has done to somebody else. He hasn't done it. He's a very nice guy. And so we have to think about, again, all of these complexities, much as we had to do when thinking about the ethical status of particular items of synthetic media. So we again need to think about defeasible heuristics. So if I'm a social media platform, I need to be thinking about not what is the one true universal rule that is exceptionless and gets everything right from the outset. That's never going to happen. Or if it happens, it would require 6 months of investigation for everything, which is not a practical heuristic for the non-ideal world in which we live. Okay. Now, I want to make sure to start off emphasizing something very important. Almost always, the primary obligation, so if some pieces of synthetic media is unethical and we think something should be done about it, almost always the primary obligation falls on the person who did the thing in the first place. Okay? It's important to recognize, because we often focus on, and in fact I'm about to focus on, the social media platforms and content platforms, but the true primary moral obligation falls on the person who made the thing in the first place. The best way to have things to prevent the production of unethical things is to not produce unethical things. And I understand that that sounds very glib and trite, but I think it's important periodically to remember that in fact the primary moral obligation falls on the people who are producing the horrific content. Right? They're the ones who actually have done the primary moral wrong in the production of the unethical content. Now, the problem, of course, is that in the non-ideal world in which we live, they aren't going to stop producing the content. They produced it. They're not upset that they produced something that was unethical. They might have gotten very well compensated for doing this. They might be advancing their other interests, and they simply don't care about the fact that what they're doing is trampling all over other people's interests. They may say, you know what? I'm, in a certain sense, selfish. My interests matter more than those people's do, so I'm just going to do it anyway, and I don't care. Okay? So we have to recognize that in the real world, actually the main secondary obligation, which is to say the obligation when somebody doesn't refrain from the production in the first place, is going to fall on the content platforms. Okay, because of informational and power asymmetries, the reality is that end users very rarely are going to be in a position to do anything of substance in response to a lot of the synthetic media that is produced. The content platforms are typically the ones who have the ability to do it, and moreover, they have a secondary obligation to do it. Simply saying, as I put up there, simply saying, well, it doesn't violate the terms of service, so there's nothing we can do, is, from an ethical perspective, it may be legally defensible, but from an ethical perspective is entirely unsatisfactory. Every one of these content platforms has a set of values and principles and community norms that they have advocated, promulgated, and attempted to enforce on the people who use their platform. And for every single one of those that any of us have looked at, saying, well, it doesn't violate the terms of service, it falls far, far short of the obligations that they have taken on by virtue of the stance that they have taken with regards to the other values and principles and norms of their community. Okay? So you don't get, just as, Tesla doesn't get to avoid ethical responsibility for autopilot by saying, well, it's beta and you knew, just as signing an end user agreement that's 27 pages long and filled with text you can't understand does not ethically absolve a company for misusing your data. Similarly, simply pointing to terms of service is an insufficient ethical response. Again, it may be legal. I do not have the letters JD after my name. I don't know. I have views about it, but I'm not a lawyer. But ethically, it clearly doesn't. Even if legally they might be covered, they're clearly ethically not. So how should we think about the ethical obligations? How do those manifest in practice? Well, again, we want to aim for sort of defeasible heuristics or rules of thumb. So think about the most obvious, what we're calling reactive response, which is something you do once an item has been produced, right? So wait for the production to occur and then respond. Content removal. Right? So there are a couple of defeasible heuristics. Now, if you are a content platform, you're going to be a little bit worried about both of these. You should be concerned about implementation of these. And I don't want to downplay the technological challenge of, for example, being able to make an inference or prediction about whether some synthetic media will likely lead to significant harm, reputational or other. That is a non-trivial inferential problem. It's not an easy ML problem to be able to infer intent or likelihood of harm or these kinds of things. So I don't want to downplay that, but nonetheless, from an ethical stance, what this at least says is that there is now a derivative moral obligation for platforms to try to do these kinds of inferences, which they have to greater and lesser degrees acknowledged that they're all already kind of doing anyway, but that in fact they have a greater obligation to do it. Now, another common technique that is used as a reactive response is dissemination control. So controlling who has access to the content. So saying, for example, can I distribute to everyone? Can I only distribute it to the people who are my friends? Can I only distribute it to the people for whom I have a contact number in the case of something like WhatsApp? Now, again, we've got reason to think that there are at least defeasible guidelines that say we should be enforcing certain kinds of dissemination control even when outright removal is not warranted. Right? So maybe that something doesn't rise to the level of that first bullet point where we would do removal, but that things that are simply likely to cause harms, even if they don't present false information, if they're likely to cause harms, maybe we should be careful about how widely it gets distributed until we know whether those harms are justified. Right? And this is particularly important because in the case of dissemination controls are asymmetrically reversible. So I can start out saying, no, you can't spread this to absolutely everybody, and then I can enable you later to send it to more people. So a certain amount of quarantining may well be justified as a defeasible matter. An initial quarantine which is then released later because, again, it is asymmetrically reversible. Once I've let you spread it to everybody, I can't put the genie back in the bottle. Okay? Now, what about a different one, which is, I'm waiting to put it up because I know as soon as I put it, I know the first rule of PowerPoint, every time you put something on the slide, everyone ignores what you're saying while they read it themselves. And this one is a surprising one. It's one where I think we've perhaps received the most pushback. And that is the question of differential promotion, up and down weighting. So in fact, we contend, if you do the ethical analysis, what you find is it is actually fairly unusual that it is ethically defensible to, in particular, downweight, but not ethically defensible to simply remove or control dissemination. That is, in fact, a very thin band of cases, largely those that involve marginalized communities, where downweighting enables them to preserve the speech and information within the community while keeping it sort of quarantined within the community but still discoverable. So it has to do with sort of trying to recognize that certain communities are at higher risk of silencing harms when you engage in removal and dissemination control. But with the exception of those, it is actually pretty rare that you can make the case that downweighting is ethically justifiable, but removal or something stronger is not. Many of the cases in which downweighting is applied are not arguably ethically justifiable. It's probably not ethically justifiable, but the platforms are doing it anyway. Lots of other cases where they say, oh, we're downweighting, you say, why don't you just remove? Because that's what's actually ethically justified. Now, I want to be clear, of course, why do the platforms disproportionately use differential promotion instead of removal? It's because it is rhetorically and legally a lot safer. If you do removal, you are accused of censorship. If you just downweight, people don't even notice. They may not even notice that you have done this. It is rhetorically safer because you can publicly say, look, we are not silencing. All we're doing is making it impossible for people to find you. Okay? Now, they don't say it quite that bluntly, but that extreme points to the fact that there is an important way to think about, what is important to think about here is that we need to be very careful about how we think about differential promotion. It is tempting to think of it as sort of the safe, easy option, but it's actually ethically kind of tricky to see why that's the right lever to be pulling. Okay. Now, one other thing that's I think a little tricky about differential promotion is, of course, all platforms have to have some kind of decision about what they will display to people, given that most people could see far more than they can see in any particular experience. Right? So it's sort of like what's known as the menu problem, which is we know that how we order items on a menu in a restaurant causally influences what you will purchase from the menu. Okay, so we can order a menu to make you more likely to buy healthy stuff. We can order a menu to make you more likely to buy stuff that makes money for the restaurant. Right? This is pretty well known how to do this. And people sometimes say, oh, that's horrible, unethical manipulation. Except you have to put things on the menu in some order. So you have to decide what you're going to prioritize. Similarly for the content platforms. To the extent that they do have control over the ways in which things are promoted or displayed, they do need to make choices about that. Even saying everything gets equal weight is itself a choice, okay, for whatever that would be. And so what is talking about here is not the idea that they might, for example, say trusted news sources will be shown higher in a news feed than random people for whom we have no background. That's not what this is talking about. This is saying because of the content, context, and intent of a synthetic media that you would up or down weight that thing. Okay, that's the thing that we're saying. It's rarely the case that that's warranted, but it wouldn't be warranted to do removal or something more like that. The other thing that's very trendy right now in these areas is labeling. I know a lot of people in this room actually work on this problem. And I'll simply note that it's pretty much always ethically permissible to label things, assuming it's a truthful or accurate label. The problem is that the labeling should be done in the right way, namely to advance community interests. And the problem is we don't know very much about this relevant psychology to know what works and what doesn't. Right? So there's a lot of work, much of it again being done by people in this room, on what are effective ways to label to advance particular community interests, whether it be in seeing truthful content or remembering truthful content or whatever it may be. So in the interest of time, I'll just breeze through these two very quickly. I just want to make sure to acknowledge that it's not just the reactive responses once media is created. Platforms actually have the ability, and we argue the obligation, to engage in proactive responses, actively trying to create, establish, and enforce community norms, which may well include things like you ought not create content that is harmful to other people. Right? Or maybe that isn't what they want to do, but it should be a deliberate choice. This norm setting that they have an obligation to actually recognize the power that they have to impact the norms of the communities that they serve, and to use that in advance of the values and interests of the community, as well as giving them, giving people the ability to do better at not being harmed by the content. So, quick conclusion, I think there's a lot of really interesting ethical issues around the synthetic media, in large part because it is not intrinsically ethical or unethical. And in the worst case, every single thing I've said has exceptions. In the worst case, you have to dive down into the absolute nitty-gritty details of every particular case. We should not let that worst case paralyze us, though. We should not stop and say, oh, okay, that means there's nothing for us to do, just let it be the Wild West, everything gets through. We already don't do that with regards to, or the platforms already don't do that with regards to things like child pornography, and other things where they have to take a stronger approach. And synthetic media, especially as we look at its impacts on our political communities, would argue, is equally problematic. And so we really need to I think we need to be, in general, a lot more aggressive than the platforms currently are. I think they are right now being very conservative, small c conservative, about not wanting to take actions. Not wanting to have policies, even, in part because they look and say the policies won't solve everything. And first of all, I don't understand why we should have expected them to solve everything, but even within that, they're being fairly conservative about not wanting to take strong action. When in fact, I think from an ethical perspective, they are on a lot firmer footing than they seem to realize. So thanks, and happy to do questions for a little while. Actually, I should make sure to check with Kathleen. So 10 minutes question?
10, 15 minutes.
10, 15? Okay, great. Yeah.
So when you talk about basically not doing harm, your examples often seem to be physical harm. But ethically, from an ethics standpoint, is there a way to discriminate or think about differences between physical versus mental harm?
Yeah, so focus some on physical. I was trying to also use examples that would involve reputational harm, which is a certain kind of mental harm. Putting on my ethicist hat here, I would argue that what we really care about the reason that harms matter is really twofold. One is the ways in which they infringe directly upon us, right, without our consent or acknowledgement. But the other is the ways in which they impact our ability to realize our goals, our values, our interests, our life plans, to use that's actually a technical term in ethics of life plan. And so there I think that when we think about physical versus mental, we need to recognize that in some sense we can trade them off, because we can think about the ways in which they do and don't impact us. Right? So it isn't that any physical harm outweighs any mental harm or vice versa. Instead, we need to think about the impacts of those harms. And so, so one of the problems with being a philosopher, especially somebody who does ethics kinds of things, is you inevitably do lots of thought experiments about really horrible things, because often it is focused on harms. But for example, me breaking my leg or somebody breaking my leg, that is, in an important sense, a different harm for me than for somebody whose job requires them to be on their feet and be capable of locomotion on their legs, right? Because for me, breaking my leg would substantially impair certain of my abilities to achieve things that matter to me, but it wouldn't mean that I would lose my job, right? So we can't just think about the immediate, we have to think about carry-on harms. So when we think in this way, I think we do see that physical and mental, we don't draw any sharp distinction between them. Now, in the real world, often it is the case that physical harms have more, any particular physical harm will typically have more of an impact on my ability to carry out my life goals than any single mental harm, right? So somebody make, an insult to me in isolation has less of an impact than, somebody assaulting me. But of course, the accumulation of insults and bullying and hate speech against me can, in the long run, have much greater impacts than a single assault. So we do have to look in these ways. Alejandra.
So most of what you said seems to me to apply in cases where the platform, let's say, or so the people other than the producer knows that it's a deep fake, that it's a lie. But what happens when the platform doesn't know what's a lie and what's not? Like they can't know what are the synthetic media, they can recognize the deep fakes.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons to be a little bit worried about wanting to broaden. So let me say a couple things. The first is that's one reason to be broader than just sort of synthetic, to think also about manipulated, because if I've manipulated it in ways that make it untruthful and that can do all these harms, cheap fakes like the Pelosi video, then, in some sense, that's just as bad as if it were generated from scratch, synthetically. This is a real problem. Detection of synthetic media is still running ahead of generation. At least this is my understanding. I do not work in this technical field, but my understanding is it still runs ahead of the best generation, but it is falling further behind in the sense of the length of time it takes to do the detection. So, it may well take 7 minutes to determine that something is synthetic, at which point think of all the harms that have been done, potentially, if it was not quarantined in advance. So I think that's a challenge. Now, in terms of the kind of expected case, the reality is most of the things that are being put out there right now tend not to be of the kind that are hard to detect. And so, whether it's straightforward manipulations that are pretty easy to detect. In fact, many times the manipulations are designed to be really obvious because then people say, oh, look, it was just satire. To the fact that there often are pretty, again, I am reporting here, I don't work in this, but fairly easy to quickly detect sort of inconsistencies and shadows and lighting and these kinds of things are not too hard to detect. But it's going to get worse. And I think this is part of the reason that I think thinking about the proactive standards or proactive responses are actually very important. Because now you can potentially put in place the ability to start doing community norm enforcement. And community norm, we know that enforcement of norms works far better when it's done by a community than when it's done in a top-down manner. Community enforcement of social norms. So having communities where, you produce something like this and people find out and you're simply, ostracized or exiled from the community would potentially be very powerful. But yeah, it's a problem. And I don't have a clean solution to it.
Can I have a small follow-up?
Sure.
So do you think that the platforms, ethically speaking, do they have an obligation to develop a way of distinguishing the lies from the accurate synthetic media, or that ethical obligation falls into someone else that is not the platform itself?
I would argue that we as a community have an ethical obligation. I don't know enough about the relevant technologies to know the proper location of that. I know there are a lot of people, for example, working on things like watermarks to establish authenticity of images and videos. Of course, the problem there is since everybody manipulates their photos, even if it's just simple Photoshop, even if it's just color adjustments, what is the watermark going to certify? Does it certify that, yes, this was in fact the thing that came out of Photoshop, but now you don't know what manipulations were done to it? Does the watermark have to encode the information about the manipulations? Does it? And of course, there are lots of non-technological ways to create manipulated photos. The history of deceptive photos is very old. And so I just don't know enough about the technology to know. I mean, there is an obligation, a general obligation, I think, for us to be able to better determine rapidly what modifications have been made to content. Who technologically bears that burden is going to depend on the technological details in a way that I'm just not fully familiar with. It's a great question, though. If anybody in this room has really deep knowledge of this, I'd love to sit down and talk about, like the different things that are being proposed, whether it's, knowing exactly what camera something came from, or process tracing, or watermarking, or other kinds of detection. I think it's a really interesting challenge to figure out who really has the moral obligation to be doing something about this? Because right now, everybody is pointing the finger at somebody else in practice. So, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I would posit that not all even bad fake media has the same level of harm.
Correct.
So how do these defeasible rules work where there is variable levels of harm created by different types of fake media? Are the ones that are the edge cases the most harmful in your experience, or are those ones tend to be covered mostly by these defeasible kind of effortful ones?
So from what so a couple of things. First, there are a couple of the defeasible rules up there that snuck in words like significant. So sort of cheated a little bit by getting those things in there as well. I didn't talk about them, but yeah. So obviously the extent of harm is clearly important here. In practice, at least from what we've looked at, the cases that would or have caused significant harm would fall under these sorts of defeasible rules. The ones that cause the smaller harms typically have various kinds of markings on them, or they are, in a context that clearly intends satire, and then it's perhaps pulled out of that context later. So there are issues there about the ways in which meaning changes when you pull it out of context, of course. But I think that these would actually cover, and in conversations with the platforms, when they've looked at these things, they've said, yeah, it seems to us that the things we worry the most about probably would be. Now, they then proceed to follow up and say, but 90% of the stuff that's getting put on our platform wouldn't fall under this. These are, in that sense, focused on sort of the cases where it's clearly ethically problematic, and it's ethically problematic to create and ethically okay to remove, for example. There's a big messy middle that we're not going to have these defeasible rules for. I worry that a lot of that is where political ads may end up residing. We don't yet know. But I think in terms of the things that are causing real psychological, physical, and social harms to people, they're mostly covered, I think.
THICAL, I feel like journalism exists to detect false content. I feel like it's always been there. This is just another form of false content.
Yeah, but journalism's really slow. So.
That's not my question.
Darn it! I thought we were able to just jump to the next one.
So each nation, right, has a set of rules in which it protects its individuals and their rights from being harmed. So the question comes up, if I create a deepfake and it harms a citizen of another country, what rights does that country then have to respond? And the interesting thing is, what if that harm is against, a party or a state or a political group? It seems like there's a slippery slope between sort of isolating from content that you don't want to have enter your society's views because now it's suddenly labeled as harmful. So how do you deal with different groups defining harm differently? And how do you think each nation is going to sort of respond and put up those barriers? We already sort of see that in terms of censoring. It just seems like it could be an easy way to censor.
I certainly hope that our analysis is not providing legitimacy or cover for massive censorship operations. Right. So a couple of things. First, just to reiterate, we're thinking here about the ethical impacts, not the legal. There's massive legal questions about jurisdiction and these kinds of things that come up in the kinds of cases you're mentioning. So I think when we think about it, we're already seeing this. We're seeing the production of lots of things that are having impacts in other countries. I don't necessarily want to go down the rabbit hole of defending this particular claim. I will simply assert we have moral obligations to people who reside in other countries, and they have moral rights and interests as well. We might appropriately and justifiably not regard their moral values and interests as constraining on me as, say, those of a loved one, of ourselves. So it's perfectly, I'm not asserting a kind of exchangeability where everybody has equal claim on me. However, when we think about a lot of these kinds of analyses, I think it's fairly straightforward to see that the general scope shouldn't vary too much between cultures. Now, where you will certainly get variation is going to be in what produces harms. Okay, so every culture has markers for relative wealth and access to resources, but what those markers are vary significantly across cultures. Similarly, we should expect that there will be some significant differences in what are the harms that are most relevant to people's ability to carry out their life plans. So maybe that I'm in a cultural setting where alienation from my family members is a deep impediment to my being able to do any of the things I care about, whereas in the United States, it's much less of an impediment to be alienated from one's family. And so I think in that sense, we are going to need, there is a certain amount of cross-cultural sensitivity that is called for in this, to have an understanding of the fact that I might produce something that is not generating harm here, but then you put it in a different context and it is. That's not to endorse a kind of, and I know you weren't suggesting this, but it's not to endorse a knee-jerk relativism that says every country gets to set its own moral values. It's also not to endorse that the state gets to legislate moral values to its citizens. That's clearly not correct. Now, where it gets really tricky is goes back to a question of that at the beginning I said I don't want to talk about, which is what are the morally relevant values and interests? Leave aside the weighting, what even are they? Is democratic participation a morally relevant value or interest that is universalizable, that is, holds of all people? That would be a whole other talk. But yeah, I think that, these are starting to get into cases where, as a policy matter, I think actually some of this becomes go more conservative, be more willing to use sort of containment techniques, at least in the short run. But yeah, it's a hard, none of this is easy. If it were easy, I wouldn't have to be standing here. Maybe one more question?
So might be related to the question. Sure. So I have a question about the definition of ethics.
Okay.
Yeah, so what is appropriate way to define we, the definition? You said what might we act given our value, but how we can see that? Who is we? So who is, right? So
Yeah.
For example, if a producer cannot share the value with the directly affected individual's value, so maybe this expert framework creates a conflict between two groups of people.
Right.
So what is a good way to see we inclusively?
Yeah, so there's it's not simple, but the simple answer is to think about it in terms of essentially, the jargony term would be stakeholder, but essentially roles, groups of people occupying different kinds of roles. So you can be in a part of multiple groups, right? I could be somebody who produces and I'm a member of a broader political community. And I can have different values in respect of those different roles that I have. To take it out of this setting, I have morally relevant values and interests by virtue of my role as a professor, as a father, as a husband, as a citizen of Pittsburgh, as a citizen of the US, as a, pick other, as a friend to other people, as an advisor to graduate students. And all of these different roles can lead to different values or interests, and a big part of the ought in how ought we act is exactly how do we resolve the tensions between those, right? Now that's within me as an individual. But the same happens at the social level, okay? So I might share values and morally relevant values and interests with many of you, maybe even all of you in the room, by virtue of our shared role as members of the Carnegie Mellon community, or the Pittsburgh academic community, or whatever it may be. And so we can think about what are the obligations that we all bear in light of that role that we have. That's the reason I was focusing on sort of the stakeholder interests and values. Now, at the biggest scale, this is ultimately what political philosophy is all about. How do you take value pluralism, the fact that you've got a diverse population of individuals who do not share the same values, and how do you, from that value pluralism, come to decisions about actions? Because you're not going to satisfy every single value. You can't do it as an individual, we can't do it as a collective. And so much of ethics and political philosophy is about giving frameworks and methods in a kind of algorithmic way for how to resolve these kinds of things. And that's when we talk about sort of political philosophy of what is the right political system or how do political systems function, when we do what we call meta-ethics, which is thinking about how to adjudicate ethical disputes. That's exactly what we're trying to resolve. So there are people working very much on this. I was largely trying to sidestep a lot of those issues because I think for a lot of these questions, it's clear enough who the different we's are and what their interests are and how to think about the ways in which they trade off. It's not perfect, it is defeasible, it's heuristic, but I think it's doable. So, yeah. All right, thank you. Because I know, Kathleen, you wanted to save a few minutes at the end.